Welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's guest is a serving police detective with over 21 years' service. He has followed the UFO subject for 35 years and in 2002 launched the PRUFOS database. That's an unofficial national police database for reporting of police UFO cases. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get him beamed up onto the ship. Detective Constable Gary Heseltine, welcome on board the Starship.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. We've got a lot to talk about, Gary. Your extensive research into UFOs. And we're going to cover the Rendlesham Forest case first,
Yeah,
which
that's fine.
has been in the news a little bit recently. Because I would say that out of anybody still alive, you have probably researched this case more thoroughly than anyone. Would you go along with that?
Well, I don't know if I'd be saying that. I mean, there were very good books. I haven't written any books, but there were very good books done by Larry Warren and Peter Robbins, Left at Eastgate, and obviously Georgina Brunei's book is a very good source. You can't tell the people. So,
Yes.
Very good books.
And so can you give us, just in sort of 4 or 5 minutes, Gary, the story of Rendlesham Forest UFO case, 1980?
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest case is regarded by most UFO researchers as the best British case ever, and arguably second only to Roswell in its stature. I think it's a case that will grow and grow as time goes on, but a brief summary of the incident is basically in late December of 1980, over 3 nights between the 25th and 26th is the first night, 26th into 27th is the second night, and the 27th into the 28th is the third night. UFOs in various guises and shapes came back to the RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge base, effectively I think to surveil it, and in particular there were incidents where a lieutenant colonel who was the deputy base commander of the base went out with a team of men following an object, a red glowing object through the trees of a forest which was called Rendlesham Forest, hence the title that we're now familiar with, where they saw at close quarter a UFO that then divided into 5 pieces, that more UFOs were seen on the horizon, that then began to move towards them. One stopped above a group of airmen, including the deputy base commander.
Charles Holt.
Charles Holt,
Yeah.
yeah, famous for the Holt Memorandum, which is arguably Britain's most famous UFO document.
Right.
And this object from about 1,000 to 2,000 feet stopped above them, shone what looked like a laser beam down at their feet. He didn't know whether it was to be a communication or whether to be frightened. They were all in awe. Later on that particular night, which is the third night, Holt's encounter is the third night, beams were shone down from a UFO into the weapons storage area, and he has gone on record saying that has gone into a weapons storage area. Now, I know, and it won't ever be officially said by Holt, but I know from having worked in my time as a Royal Air Force police officer between 1983 and 1989, I served on 2 identical nuclear storage areas, and that was beams shone down into a nuclear weapons storage area.
And I believe one of the, if not the largest storage of nuclear weapons in Europe at that time.
And that's the rumour. I have that off the record, but I believe that was probably why UFOs came there. And
Yes.
what shouldn't be forgotten is the political context of why then would they be interested. Well, in 1980,
Yes.
the Soviet Union was in its final throes of power, and the Polish Solidarność movement led by Lech Wałęsa was rocking the boat in Poland. And at the time of Rendlesham, there were literally hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops massing on the borders of Poland.
Yes.
So the world was in a very dangerous place. And when I look back now as to why UFOs would go to that base, it maybe was because there were nuclear weapons there that shouldn't have been there, and that they were probably in breach of all the arms treaties of the day.
And just to add in there, Gary, it's not the only case. There are many, many, many cases in the United States and in Russia of UFOs examining weapon storage sites.
Oh, absolutely, and I think we'll touch upon it later in the programme. There's just been a recent press conference put together by Captain Robert Salas, who was in charge of one of these nuclear facilities in 1967, where his missiles were effectively disabled by a UFO that hovered over their silos.
Maelstrom, I think that one.
Yeah, that's Maelstrom, 1967 in Montana.
All right then, Gary. Now, what about one of them actually landed and was examined by Jim Penniston? Would you care to tell us about that and what he witnessed briefly?
Yeah, I mean,
Which night was that on?
The first night's activity was the night of Christmas night into Boxing Day, and literally just after midnight, going into Boxing Day morning, strange lights were reported by the East Gate. Cutting a long story short, Jim Penniston, Ed Kabanzak and John Burroughs went out to effectively investigate what these lights were. They initially thought that it might be an aircraft in distress. However, later on, Burroughs and Penniston tracked an object through the trees, manoeuvring, small object, perhaps the size of a car, manoeuvring through the trees until they came to a small clearing. In the clearing, Penniston actually moves forward and sees a landed object. He walks around it, he takes his police pocketbook out, he begins to make notes, he draws pictures, detailed pictures. He notices that as he goes around the craft that there are raised symbols which he describes and has documented in his police pocketbook. He actually touches the object, which is described as being glass-like.
So he touches this UFO?
He touches it, yeah.
He said it was like cut glass, didn't he?
He said it was like a glass-like feel and that it was slightly warm to the touch. Now, how many other kind of reports do we have where there is such an interaction with the object? This is clearly a structured object, and this is not somebody who we would regard as a fool, an idiot.
Yeah.
He is a tech sergeant, a very experienced US Air Force police officer, accompanied by another Air Force police officer, John Burroughs. So these are very credible people, and it's an incredible event.
He said that the air was electrically charged, that he could feel it, and he also commented on the incredible speed when it actually lifted off the ground and then was gone in very
What he
quickly.
describes is that as the object begins to rise off the ground, they hit the deck instinctively. When it begins to lift up, it then goes to a sort of treetop height, tilts on its side, and then gone in the blink of an eye.
And it left impressions in the ground as well, which would...
He didn't know that at the time, but when he got back, he was not sure quite what to report to his shift commander, thinking who's going to believe me kind of thing. So he was a bit reticent and gave a guarded account and basically watered it down and said that they'd tracked a mechanically object moving through the forest. They didn't initially mention the fact that it landed. However, he was told to go back at first light and look for any evidence of where this object was. And when he did go back, they found broken branches and they found 3 equilateral impressions in the ground, literally to a depth of 1.5 inches, literally 8 feet apart in a triangular.
These were 3 circles in the shape of a triangle.
Yeah, they're all the same, about 7 inches by 1.5 inches deep, and they're all spaced out about 8 feet apart.
So do you know, Gary, because I've heard different numbers, how many airmen actually witnessed the craft?
What, on the first night?
On across the 3, say.
Well, I will talk about Colonel Holt probably a bit later on, but he will himself, and I've seen him on documentaries, where he will say there's perhaps maybe 50, 60 people involved in peripheral roles, but such was the degree of UFO activity over those 3 nights. Some people saw things at various different parts of the base.
So 50 to 60
so there are
witnesses.
Yeah, there are undoubtedly a lot more witnesses, and that was what drew me as a police officer to the case anyway. One, because I'd worked on those sites, and I knew that there must be more witnesses, especially witnesses who I suspect were in the towers on each of those nights.
Now, when you've studied this case, Gary, you've approached it as a detective would. because you told me that you did what they call a timeline,
Yeah.
and it's on a great big long piece of paper spread over 3 days. Each segment is an hour or whatever, and you plot
as
it
best
out.
we can from the known facts. Yeah.
So very, very detailed sort of analysis, and you read all of the different books that
That's what I did.
That case, added them to the timeline, and then added all of the witness statements to the timeline. So you've built up a very clear picture as to what happened over that.
Yeah, I think what I did was I spent 4 months researching all the known TV documentaries, known books, articles, etc., getting what I would call the accepted facts, the corroborated facts. There's also, in this case, there's a lot of hearsay, which you have to be very careful about.
Yes.
So what I've tried to do with the timeline is to try to make it as factual as possible. So it really concentrates on the things that are accepted as fact.
Mm-hmm. And just at this point, I'd like to bring in this particular article, which was on the BBC website about Rendlesham, and it appeared a few months ago, and it's written by the famous ufologist Evan Davis of the BBC.
Well,
and you know, just to come out with some statements of this article, he took me to the place where the airmen reported seeing flashing lights in the sky. There we were greeted by the sight of the Orford Ness lighthouse a few miles away. So this article is trying to make out that all of these 50 to 60 airmen were over 3 nights were seeing a lighthouse, and this is confirmed by researcher Ian Ridpath. And you know, what can we say about this kind of
well, first and foremost, I've never heard him raise his voice as a UFO commentator before, so that's a surprise.
Evan Davis.
Evan Davis, he's well known and probably very good at what he does in his day job, as it were. But certainly within the UFO community, I've never heard him speak on UFOs before, which is slightly bizarre. And for somebody who is well known and who is presumably an investigative journalist, he has lent himself to a very poor piece of journalism for the simple reason is that he hasn't checked out the facts with the actual people who were there. It's very easy to make assertions, but you have to rely on the testimony. Mm-hmm. And in this particular case, what makes this case so good, and in my opinion better than Roswell, is because these are all military trained police officers. You know, they're working with nuclear weapons day in, day out. They have secret clearance to work on those bases. They're highly vetted to do the job that they do. They're trained to protect nuclear weapons. These are police officers who undergo proper police training, military police training. We're not talking about young recruits. In the main, we're talking about many airmen with many years' service in the US Air Force. And in the case of Holt, we're talking about a man with a very distinguished career who was the deputy base commander of what I know is a nuclear facility. Now, that testimony should not be ignored, especially when it's corroborated by, when he went out with a team of 4 other people, 3 of which have gone on the record, one of which doesn't want to go on the record, and who knows why, but the 3 that have gone on the record all confirm in slightly different ways, because it's different perspectives, but there were clear UFOs seen at close quarter. So we are talking about a major UFO event, and for a journalist of his renown in a different sphere of work to cast aspersions as to their credibility, i.e. the likes of Holt and his men, is a total disgrace in my opinion.
Well, we're going to go for a short break, Gary. So I think before we go, I'll just get rid of this piece of BBC disinformation. Okay, join us after the break.